Much, Dominic, for inviting me to speak. It's a great pleasure to talk to you. And I see some of the names on the screen, very distinguished scholars. So that's really interesting to hear what people say. I just need to give you just one warning, which is that I'm almost certainly at some point going to be joined by my ginger cat. Who has appeared in PhD vivas and meetings and church services and so forth, so that he will appear. What I want to do is for 30 minutes is not to give you in any sense a formal paper, but to give you some of my reflections. I edited the novel for OUP in 2016, well, it came out in 2016, and I haven't thought about it or read it since, but this invitation prompted me to reread it, and here are some thoughts about it. I think the first thing for us to remember, as I'm sure you know, is that there is a very remarkable context for this. Trollope had written to William Makepeace Thackeray in early October 1859 to suggest that he provided some short stories for the new Cornhill magazine. And rather to his surprise, Thackeray wrote back and said, could he have a novel instead? This was good news in one respect, but of course, Trollope was about to not only move house, but move country from Ireland to take up a new job as post office surveyor for the Eastern District and to move into Waltham Cross. So that was pretty tricky. He had, of course, a full-time day job as that post office civil service, and worse, he was also in the middle of another novel called Castle Richmond, which was contracted for Chapman Hall, it's an Irish novel. So Chapman Hall allowed him, rather astonishingly, to suggest that that Thackeray might want to take that instead. But Thackeray, and I'll return to this point at the end, Thackeray thought that an Irish novel would not sell so well, and could Trollope really go back to the territory of Barchester, which he was making his own. So Trollope sets out to write Framley Parsonage at high speed. The only other challenge that he had was that he'd never done serialization before. And I think one of the things that we can see just occasionally in Framley is that he miscalculates. Sometimes there's a little bit of padding at the end of a chapter where you realise he hasn't got enough words. He's not yet confident in serialization. Why should he be? And I think what happens later with Trollope and serialization is he becomes very interested in the reading experience produced by serialization and starts to experiment with what it feels like to read in installments. And for me, the climax of those experimentation is the installment publication of The Way We Live Now, famously the Trollope novel for people that don't like Trollope novels. Now, what he does here, is rather brilliantly, I think, is to play with the reader's sense of the simultaneity of events that serialization can produce, something which we might call the simultaneous present. And Claire Pettit from King's College London has very deftly argued that the novel's playing with time, with serialization, or even tempts us to reshuffle the chapters so that we could read them in a different order, like they were a pack of cards that we could change. Framley doesn't do that. It's not as assured in the serialization as he would later become. Some things that interest me in this novel began in a railway carriage. Trollope, as you know, discovered that he could write perfectly well in a train. Not possible these days, but well, not in the British trains. Novel begins at high speed. He takes a break in the middle of it to complete Castle Richmond, and then turns back to it. Now, this is the first thing that topics that I find interesting, how they're handled in Framley Parsonage. Character. Big topic. Trollope, we know, thought that character was really what the novel should do. Stephen Wall's 1988 book, as you'll know, picks up really on an autobiography's assertion about the nature of fiction. That is, a novel, Trollope said, should give a picture of common life, enlivened by humour and sweetened by pathos. To make that picture worthy of attention, the canvas should be crowded with real portraits, not of individuals known to the world or to the author, but of created personages impregnated with traits of character which are known. To my thinking, the plot is but a vehicle for all of this. Classic Trollope statement about what Trollope did, but it's quite an odd statement to think of in relation to Framley, it seems to me. Common life, well, not very much common life, Crawley, I suppose. Humour, well, Miss Dunstable, I suppose, and the semi-funny scene of Harold Smith's disastrous lecture. But perhaps the oddest statement is crowded with real portraits, which makes me think about the nature of character in this novel, because it does seem to me that Trollope is doing something quite daring and potentially risky. But one of the thought-provoking elements of Framley Parsonage, as I read it, is how far Trollope is not interested in portraiture that has very much detail. Now, Dickens had, of course, revealed, and is continuing to reveal, the astonishing interest that a novel might have with, let us use Ian Forster's slightly unsatisfactory but nonetheless useful term, flat characters. Dickens, in presenting us with many of those, shows just how magnetic fiction with flat characters could be. And here in Framley, we are, I think, presented with a striking number of these. These are fictional creations, that is to say, where the reader is not given a sense of a particular complex interiority. Mark Robarts would be an example of this, for instance. Trollope is not concerned, for example, to make Mark's decision to sign Sowerby's bill feel particularly psychologically credible. It happens very quickly, and it happens almost without an account of Mark's reasons. But we have even less of an account as to why he signs the second one, or why he buys that expensive horse, which oscillates between £130 and £150. There was a mistake in the printed edition, which Trollope never corrected. The most explicit example is Griselda Grantley, who is fascinatingly, openly offered to us as readers as a figure without real substance. But Lucy, we read, could not but observe that Griselda herself seemed to have very little to say, or at any rate, to say very little. Every now and again, she did open her mouth, and some word or brace of words would fall from it, a brace of words, 2 words. But for the most part, she seemed to be content in the fact that Lord Luston was paying her attention. She showed no animation, but sat there still and graceful, composed and classical, as she always was. Trollope is intriguingly playing here with the possibilities of a novel that does not, Parche, his own later statement in an autobiography, find its primary interest in psychology. And there's an interesting broader question here, isn't there, about the temptation that we have, and often it should endeavour to resist, which is the temptation of readers to believe in the reality of fictional characters, in some way or another to think that they are living forms about whose interior lives we can talk. It's almost as if, it seems to me, in Framley, and it's unique to Framley, but I notice it particularly strikingly in Framley, it is almost as if Trollope is testing his readers' capacity to resist the desire to believe in characters by giving us so many ones with minimal depth, or characters like Mark Robarts, where something very, very significant happens in their lives, but with moments which aren't really constellated by a particular explanatory narrative. It's something as a hint, it's something that is Dickensian in its daring, I think. Part of the issue here, it seems to me, is visible in Trollope's decision in the novel to offer us pairings of friends that he really hardly explains, just as he offers minimal explanations for Robarts' disastrous bill signing. Sowerby and Robarts, Fanny and Lady Lufton, they're curious pairings that Trollope is offering us, as if again sort of buttressing this idea that he is looking for and interested in situations which he does not wish to provide more substantial psychological narrative for. And this is to say nothing, of course, of the lovers, Griselda and Lord Dumblelow, for instance, and even Lucy and Lord Lufton. A point to note, and this is going to take this observation in a different direction. So, a point to note, it seems to me, is that some of the characters, some of the moments in the characters do suggest that Trollope is interested in something else in the representation of character. And those are moments where the novel allows, or it seems to invite us to infer motives or more complex psychologies than are actually described. Now, my unlikely starting point for making that comment is the gloriously named Lord Dumblelow. Now, you'll remember, of course, that he absconds shortly before having to marry Griselda and has to be forced back from France by Archdeacon Grantley. Now, at one level, this must be a kind of joke. We're being permitted to smile at a character running away from a prospective union with nothing much more than a pretty cipher. It's as if Dumblelow is, so to speak, trying to escape from a novel in which he is condemned to marry the flattest of its flat characters. One way of looking at it. But another way might be to think that there's some distinction in this point, because Trollope perhaps is allowing his readers to sense that he has created a figure with an implied internal life, which is more complicated than he has told us. He permits us in this respect to wonder about that impossible thing, a real psychology in a fictional character. And there's another example of this novel's creation against its own trend, it seems to me, of characters whom we are permitted to think might be more complicated than the literal words admit. And another example of this would be the, quotes, stern, unpleasant Mr. Crawley. It is as if with him, as with Lord Dumblelow, that Trollope is experimenting against his own habit in the novel of staying with relatively two-dimensional figures. And he's experimenting by allowing, as I say, the reader to infer rather than telling them directly. We find ourselves asking again that impossible question. What is Crawley's motives for this? Why is he so complicated and difficult? His pride and his stubborn refusal of kindness and gifts we are told about. But Trollope makes Crawley sufficiently peculiar, I think, and this is obviously followed up in the last chronicle, to prompt his readers to recognise a different form of psychological presentation in fiction. This is one that we don't see it as flat so much as incompletely described, as fascinatingly unexplained. Now, there are other things that are like Crawley's character, or even Lord Dumbello's character, that are, the novel invites us to think below the surface, it seems to me. Things to be inferred rather than simply received. Things that are implied rather than simply described. Now, one of those is certainly Ireland. Now, we know that Castle Richmond was in progress while Framley was too. That story is set during the Great Famine, a narrative of two cousins in love with the same woman. Now, that plot faintly reappears, I suppose, in Framley in the Griselda plot. Lord Lufton is planned to marry her, chiefly by his mother, and Dumbello does in the end. There's a faint echo, I suppose, of the Castle Richmond main plot here. But the Irish topics and the imagining and experience of Ireland, I think, are more prominent elsewhere, though never explicit. The threat of impoverishment and the arrival of bailiffs, the Philistines at the parsonage, strike me as echoes or recastings of some of Trollope's experiences in Ireland, particularly from his knowledge of the Great Famine, dispossession, and poverty. And in a sense, it's a gesture to the ongoing land ownership problems of Ireland that would concern Trollope all the way to the unfinished The Landleaguers, published posthumously in 1884. Robarts and Fanny are having their possessions seized. They're about to be made, to all intents and purposes, made homeless. And also the typhus, at this point nicknamed the Irish fever, the typhus-stricken Mrs. Crawley in a lowly house with small children and an exceptional impoverishment. Again, it seems to me, it recasts something of Trollope's attentiveness to the famine experience, some of which John McCourt has discussed in his book on Trollope and Ireland. The kidnapping at Hogglestock, rather a strange name for that particular chapter, it seems to me, is the painful narration in which Dean Arabin tries to avoid, as he says, prying into Mr. Crawley's poverty. And these scenes of dispossession and then with Crawley of lack of money and hunger, seeing versions of Ireland. Note that the salary of Mr. Crawley is £130 a year. Trollope was paid £1,000 for writing this novel, which, if we use the RPI, roughly speaking, that's about £50,000 in contemporary terms. £130 a year is what the rather neatly what the erroneous amount for Mr. Crawley's Mark Robarts' horse costs. It's in the manuscript as 150, but it appears once. It's just a sort of biting moment, I think, where Robarts can spend exactly the same amount on a horse as Crawley earns throughout the year. But I'm going to end with something that strikes me, and I have written about in relation to the way we live now, but an implicit other narrative that runs beneath Framley Parsonage, as it seems to me it runs beneath so many other examples of Trollope's fiction. Perhaps, as I indicate, reaching a climax, if not its climax, in The Way We Live Now and in non-fictional prose, in an autobiography. And this is another element that it seems to me, it lies beneath the surface of the novel. And it's a different kind of elemental narrative. If we can see, there's a certain sort of narrative in Ireland present in the book. There's an even bigger underlying narrative, it seems to me, and that is the narrative that Anthony Trollope is not Thomas Anthony Trollope. Of course, as you know, Thomas Anthony Trollope was Anthony Trollope's unfortunate, if not feckless, certainly reckless, but also clearly unfortunate father. The story of Trollope's family life, the loss of the assumed estate that the father believed that he would inherit, Thomas Anthony's exceptional gift at irritating other people, particularly the land owner from whom he rented property, and his inability to provide adequately for, or anywhere near adequately for, his own family, leading Fanny to Frances Trollope to spend so much of her time writing. These are scoring and scarring events for Trollope, and you'll remember that at the beginning of his own professional career, if that's quite the right word, is described in an autobiography in dismal terms. Trollope unabashedly, abashedly, but candidly describes his own wastrel life as an impoverished young clerk in Marylebone, listening, this is such a memorable moment, isn't it? Listening to the sound of the workhouse bell off Marylebone High Street, now the location, it has to be said, part of the University of Westminster, and wondering how long it would be before he was inside, because of an inability to earn enough money. It's Ireland here, isn't it, that saves him, in which he begins to make a really successful career for the post office. But in a plot in which poverty is finally avoided in the form of Lord Lufton bailing out Mark Robarts, it seems to me is a version of that life that Anthony Trollope, as he sat down to write Framley Parsonage, knew himself. Newly promoted as post office surveyor to the Eastern District, he had at last begun to live successfully. The letter from Thackeray from the Cornhill, and what would turn out to be the enormous success of Framley Parsonage. When the instalments came to an end, Thackeray wrote rather ruefully to say that more than 1,000 subscribers to the Cornhill had packed it in. I just wanted to get to the end of Framley Parsonage and then didn't want anymore. It's a plot that affirms that Trollope had himself, it recasts that sense, that confidence that Trollope had avoided the fate of his own father, and had begun to succeed. The bailiffs are turned away in the plot, literally, as they had been, so to speak, in Anthony Trollope's life. Thank you very much.